Good morning, Doc Menchi. Doc Menchi, should we start around 8:15 just to wait for more participants? Because the announcement has just been resent. Okay, thank you, Ms. Feb. I think we are starting now. This session has been live streamed, so I think we can start now. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning po.
Thank you. So can we have the slides shared? Can I, maybe I'll start with this one. So we can start now. It's not showing. I've shared my screen. Oops, ayan na naman. Miss Feb, maybe yours is ano. I'm having.
Should I share screen instead, Doc?
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. I'm sharing screen, but looks like it's not showing here.
Okay po.
So I'll stop sharing. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay na, Doc.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Feb. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the webinar. Our webinar this morning is about the title first, Do No Harm, Food Safety Matters in Nutrition. This is one of the topic that is under the theme for the webinar this month on food and nutrition security. So our webinar speaker is our esteemed guest, Dr. Cecilia Cristina Acuin. Next, please. And the seminar is about nutrition, which she says fuels the growth, not just of individuals, but of communities, nations, and the global economy. So this is a very timely topic this time. According to her, good nutrition, like good health, is achieved through a complex process that begins with access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And she will also discuss in this webinar the roles of science in this complex process. And I will not mention here because she is going to present them during the seminar. In this webinar also, she will provide a food systems framework to illustrate the connectedness of these different roles, as well as the multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder connections involved in food safety. So she will also show examples from the Philippines and another country in Asia to highlight gaps in food safety, particularly those that threaten food and nutrition security. Next, please. So let me, or allow me to introduce our speaker. Our esteemed speaker is Dr. Cecilia Cristina Acuin. We fondly call her Dr. Ces. She's currently an adjunct associate professor at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños, and she took her PhD in nutrition at Cornell University, MA in medical anthropology at the University of Connecticut, and Doctor of Medicine at UP Manila. So her international research involvements range from in different capacities, from being members of the UNU, International Union of Nutritional Sciences Committee on Nutrition and Anthropology, also with other partners in Asia, in South America, and in Africa, She developed tools for assessing vitamin A, food sources, and then as vice chair she also was vice chair at WPRO Regional Advisory Committee on Health Research in the WHO Western Pacific region. She is also a lead investigator for assessing country research capacities for child health and nutrition for Asia and the Pacific, and has assessed zinc supplementation in a multi-country setting. And because of this engagement, she's able to develop formative research tools for the introduction of zinc supplements in national diarrhea control programs. She has also developed infant and young child feeding indicators that are now used globally by WHO and UNICEF. So here in the Philippines, she is a chief science research specialist at the Nutritional Assessment and Monitoring Division of the Department of Science of DOST a few years back. And prior to her retirement, she was also an Irish human nutrition scientist, and her work ranged from micronutrient deficiency to nutrient-dense varieties, metabolic issues related to rice consumption, rice safety concerns, and then she is also currently the chair of the technical advisory group to the Golden Rice Project. And currently, she is a World Bank's nutrition technical advisor in the Philippines and is involved in the Philippine Multisectoral Nutrition Project of the World Bank, which is a maiden nutrition project in the country. May I now introduce Dr. Ces Aquin. Dr. Ces.
Yes, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Nolly, for the generous introduction. It is always humbling to think about all of the people who helped you along the way when your CV is being introduced. So without further ado, because I would like to really have some time for our question and answer and discussion later. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and go straight into our topic for today. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes, Doc.
Okay, that's great. So
Thank you.
is it okay to start, Nolly?
Yes, please, Dr. Ces.
Okay, so let's start and let's see. Okay, so I'm going to start with of course, the global what do you call this? The global impetus for all of the things we do in development, and those are the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, almost all of the goals, there are 17 of them, can of course be linked to good nutrition, but the most important, if there is anything I want you to remember from this seminar, is that unsafe food is not food. And so in the desire to provide enough food to be available to people, to make it accessible, we should not forget that what needs to be provided is safe and nutritious food. And in this cycle of providing for food, the assessment of safety is from the consumption perspective. So I hope that that is something you will keep in your minds as you listen to my presentation today. Of the SDGs, it is of course obvious that safe food is very much incorporated in SDG 1, which it has to do with poverty alleviation, and SDG 3, which has to do with health and well-being. But the most crucial ones, I think, that are relevant to this particular lecture are SDGs 2 and 12. And one of the concerns regarding the SDG 2, which is to end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture, is that even before the COVID pandemic, food security was already rising. So there were already indications from the monitoring being conducted by the UN agencies that we were not achieving our food security goals globally, particularly in parts of Asia and in Africa. And the pandemic is likely to have worsened this, although we are still collecting the data. As you know, many data systems faltered during the pandemic. So we are collecting the data to determine exactly what the effect has been, particularly to food systems. But we really fear that the consequences are being felt by our children. And the consequences in terms of stunting and wasting can be lethal if the child is deprived enough, but can also be lifelong if he survives, but is stunted, will have lifelong consequences in terms of his adult productivity and his long-term well-being. Of also equal importance in terms of the goals that food safety is part of is SDG 12, which is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And as we know, from the time that the SDGs were developed, about more than, my gosh, almost 20 years ago na pala ngayon, that the world has been consuming natural resources unsustainably. And this is largely because we are more driven by the provision of food in quantitative terms rather than in qualitative terms. And we hope that the COVID pandemic serves as a wake-up call so that we can do more efficiently without compromising the future of our children, the next generations of humanity. So as you can see from this slide, this was, I think, collated by the UN in 2021, if I'm not mistaken, that at that time we were already losing about 13.8% of our food supply just through the food supply chains. And also, sorry, this was 2016 pala. The data is from 2016. But we know from the news that so much food was wasted during the pandemic because of system failures. So we hope that you will also consider these goals as we listen to the rest of the presentation, because we need to do something. Otherwise, our food systems are going to fail us again. They're already failing us, but they will fail us even more in terms of not just food security, but even more so for food safety. So those of you who have listened to me before are probably sick and tired of this slide on the food system, but I don't know the audience very well for PAASE, so I wanted to make sure that we are starting from the same page. And I think that there is really no replacement for this kind of framework when we talk about anything about food, and most especially when we talk about food safety. We will go back to this again later when we talk about regulations and when we talk about how we should move forward. So the food system is really the chain of things, or all the elements, the activities, and then the outputs of these activities that come together so that we can produce food, distribute them, and make them available to consumers for better health and better nutrition. So that's essentially what the food system does. But seeing it in a framework like this helps us to understand the connectedness of each of the different parts of the system, which is important because before, especially for us scientists, we get so immersed in our jobs that are, in silos. We work on an experiment, we work on a project, we are seeing only the dimensions of that particular experiment or that particular project. Or we work in an institution and we see only the work of that institution. But we should see what we do in terms of the larger picture, because what we do affects the other things down the road or downstream, and are affected by so many things upstream. And these things that we might think we have no control over are actually important to our work. So the thing about appreciating the role of the food system is that each of us who play roles in the system can acknowledge our ownership and accountability, not just for what we do specifically, but also for what the system does as a whole. So I hope that, again, things to keep in mind and also look forward to in the discussion. Now, if you translate that food system, so that I hope you see the food supply chain, food environment, and individual factors. When you translate that into the value chain, which is how economists view it, no? And because of the way that our global development is organized, the economists, because they hold the purse strings, usually drive the perspective of development discussions. So what nutritionists have done here is to lay out in from the perspective of the value chain. So the value chain are the arrows that you see in the middle. So from input to production, post-harvest, processing, distribution, marketing and retail, and finally consumption and food utilization. So these are the different points in the food value chain where it's called the value chain because every stage is supposed to add value to the eventual product, in this case, which is food. But what nutritionists have done is for each of these particular stages, laid out what are the ways by which we can maximize the entry of nutrition into the value chain. And those are the boxes on top. And the boxes below are the ways by which we can keep nutrition from exiting the value chain so that we reduce the loss of nutrients. When you consider that so much goes into our food production, from the moment that you select the land, put in water and all of the inputs into food production, you're already investing quite a lot into that food. And to lose the nutrients at any point in the value chain is not just an opportunity cost, but is also, I think, a real loss of the efforts and the inputs. And if we start all over again, then that means that's lost forever. So from the perspective of let's say, a smallholder farmer, that can be disastrous. And that is why we need to prevent or minimize nutrition exiting from the value chain. Now, the points at which food safety, of course, is embedded in all of these different points. But the most obvious ones, as you will appreciate, would be in the post-harvest stage. You see there as an example aflatoxin control, which we will talk a little about, as well as contamination and spoilage below. And then towards the middle parts, you will see nutrient losses during milling, which can also be a consequence of unsafe food, and so on down the line. So I think that it is important for us to also be aware of these occurrences in the food value chain. Can you please hold for a few minutes? Tito, I'm already starting my lecture and when she wants to talk to me, can you please attend to him? Yeah, my apologies. So I would like to frame our discussion, our food safety discussion, in terms of what are the challenges to our scientists. And they really range from certain, from the processes that our food system our food safety system undergoes. So the first would be in identifying new and emerging, and I'm going to say sub-radar threats. So sub-radar threats are those that are neither new nor emerging. They've always been there, but have not been recognized, either because we do not um, test for them, or we're not aware that there are risks coming from their consumption. So we're going to discuss at least one of those. And then we, of course, very obviously, we will talk about the elimination and mitigation of these threats. And this may be the most well-known role of scientists, because I know that many of us have worked on these areas, and I'll also show some examples, particularly from rice. Another part or another process that we may not be that active in, but I think that we should, as I will explain to you later, is the area of policy and regulation, because this is really where we can have um, a, a larger effect, because the policy and regulations affect the entire country, or the entire governance area where the policies and regulations operate. So instead of just having an impact on one experiment, or having an impact on one institution, policies and regulations really allow us to have a larger impact on our population. And there is room for policy analysts, for organizational development specialists, and systems development specialists to help with food safety. And then finally, for prevention and control, and I think this is something that's very familiar to everyone, because this is what actually reaches the consumer. So this is very much in the realm of behavioral scientists, but I know that many of our natural and physical scientists also contribute to prevention and control. So at each of these processes, we all contribute, and I hope that you will find your role in one of them. And the chain doesn't stop there, of course. It goes back to new, because there will be continuing threats to our food system that the cycle continues. Before we talk about the threats, let's talk about what we eat. So I got this data from our National Nutrition Survey. So this is the most recent data. And I think this is a household level, not individual level. The average Philippine household has about 4 to 5 members. So you can divide this roughly by 4 or 5 individuals to have a ballpark of how much goes to each individual. But the point of showing this is not so much the quantity as it is the quality of the diet of our fellow Filipinos. So what you can see here is that the foods have been grouped. So they are in food groups, and that, of course, what dominates the diet is still rice. 35% of the intake in terms of grams or in terms of weight is still coming from rice. And if you add the ones from corn and other cereal products, that's easily 40% of the intake coming from cereals. The next largest group would be the protein sources, especially the animal source foods. So you'll see poultry, meat products, and fish. And of these, you will appreciate really that it's still, despite the prices of fish these days, and that's another conversation we can have later, the main protein source of most of our people, so this is the average intake, will still be coming from fish and fish products. And it is only a smaller slice that is coming from other animal source foods like milk and eggs and legumes. So you have about maybe 10% coming from that. The larger slice after proteins, because proteins occupy about 20+%, the next larger slice will be coming from vegetables. So you can see that our diet is really still a combination of rice, fish, and vegetables, but the specific food items that are contributing to rice, fish, and vegetables have been changing over time. And again, if you have questions, we can talk about that later. But the appreciation of the diet is important to food safety because you can infer the magnitude of the problem from what the population is consuming. And that's the perspective that total diet studies take, and that's what, and we will discuss that later in our webinar. The other thing that's important to remember is that within these averages are differences in consumption patterns. So I just show some differences in terms of urban-rural disaggregations and in terms of income class. And I think it is very obvious. I know you'll be drawn to the income class right away. So let's start with that. I think it's very obvious that poorer households have higher intake of carbohydrate-rich foods, and richer households have higher intake of protein-rich foods. And therefore, food safety issues regarding or involving cereals and products will have a larger cross-cutting effect and will have a bigger impact on poorer households compared to those that would affect protein sources. But of course, we advocate for balanced and diverse diets. And so any items that are, or any food groups that are unsafe would affect the population as a whole. In general, urban households have higher intake of fish, meat, and poultry and other non-rice cereal products, while rural households have higher intakes of rice and rice products and tubers. And surprisingly, sugars as well. We expect the vegetables and fruits to be higher in rural households because they have better access, and most of them produce their own food, their own vegetables and fruits. So again, bear this in mind when you, as we listen to some of the problems we have in terms of food safety. Now, I talked earlier about new emerging and sub-radar threats, and there are many. I'm just choosing one because if you remember the entry and exit of nutrition in the food value chain, aflatoxins was one of those that were singled out in that particular nutrition value chain interaction. So let's talk about mycotoxins. I know you know they are secondary metabolites of fungi. So they're produced by fungi, commonly the fungi of Aspergillus, Penicillium, and Fusarium. But there are many other fungi that produce mycotoxins. These are just the more common ones and the ones that have been better studied. And the mycotoxins can develop during any of the stages from production all the way to storage of grains, nuts, tubers, and other crops. We don't have time to discuss all of the other crops, but I'm going to give some examples from grains and nuts. So they are poisons, you know, for the lay in our audience, they are poisons. The consumption of mycotoxins in huge amounts can have acute effects which are fatal. So pag madami kang kinain na pagkain na may mycotoxin, you can die from it. Over time, when you consume small amounts, you maybe you won't die, but you might develop cancers. So liver cancers, kidney cancers, these are all linked to mycotoxin intake. They are harmful to both humans and animals. And so even if we don't eat them ourselves, if we feed mycotoxin contaminated food to animals, the animals themselves will suffer from the mycotoxins. And then if we eat those animals, the cumulative effect of mycotoxins can still affect the human through that way. So it is not something inconsequential, and that's why I'm considering it a sub-radar threat, because people are not often aware that this is a problem. And in the Philippines, even more so, because the only mycotoxin lab that I know of, which was in DOST FNRI, where I used to work, had closed, about 15 years ago or 20 years ago for safety reasons and has not been revived. But it is absolutely essential that we have a way of assessing our risks from mycotoxins. And I hope that through this seminar, we can stimulate some interest and eventual funding for the assessment of this threat to our food safety. Now, the chronic effects of mycotoxins are also some of them are quite well known. So for example, aflatoxin contributes up to 30% of liver cancer cases. And madami-dami na po tayong liver cancer cases ngayon. Now that liver cancers are better diagnosed, I think we can make the case that aflatoxin and other mycotoxins might be contributing to this. They also, mycotoxins cause immunosuppression, no? And I'll show you the pathway later that can aggravate HIV and malaria. And one of the more recent findings that has really alarmed nutritionists is that mycotoxins have been identified as contributing to childhood growth faltering. So even if they don't eat a lot of food that is contaminated with mycotoxin, children who are exposed to it in minute amounts, if they are exposed to it chronically, so over the long term, can develop, can be underweight and stunted and will have reduced cognitive development. That is because what the mycotoxins do is they cause an inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract lining, which interferes when this inflammation is continuing, interferes with the absorption and metabolism of vitamins and minerals and contributes to protein, malnutrition, and gastrointestinal toxicity. And there is now evidence that it also affects the efficacy of oral vaccines. So it is, again, as I said, it can be a considerable threat and one that we do not normally think about, and so we do not do anything about. But there are many ways by which mycotoxin enters our food system. So it can come in from the plant products initially, so there are biological factors. Of course, fungi are everywhere in our environment, and they can come from a range of pathways in our environment. They can even come from insects or birds who can spread the disease. During harvesting, if the harvesting is not done according to good production practices, then there may be potential for mycotoxins to grow and or for the fungi to grow, and then for the mycotoxins to be expressed in our foods. Storage is a very vulnerable part of the mycotoxin development, especially here in our country, because we do not store our food properly. And those of us who work in food systems understand this very much. If you've seen the way our rice is stored, the way our corn is stored, the way our nuts, our peanuts, our other especially plant sourced foods are stored, you will understand why this is such a concern. And I already explained earlier that even if these foods are not given to humans, if they are given to animals, and the animals can then concentrate the mycotoxin, when we consume the animals, we get the mycotoxin that way. So maraming pathways. There are many opportunities for mycotoxin to enter our food system. Now, I told you earlier that I am going to explain to you a little of how mycotoxins are believed to contribute to impaired growth in children. So you see here 3 possible pathways from aflatoxins, from deoxynivalenol, and from fumonisins. The pathways are a little different because each of the mycotoxins has a different effect on the gastrointestinal tract. But I think you appreciate the larger, so I'm not going to go into details because I know some some of you are actually not physiologists, but there are essentially two different pathways by which these mycotoxins then cause impaired growth in children. So one way is through impaired nutrient uptake. So that's this vertical text over here. And then on the other side is through what we call environmental enteropathy, where you have the intestinal lining, and this is more than just inflammation. The intestinal lining actually gets changed, and the changes allow for the leak of some of the mycotoxins in, so they in effect they override the gastrointestinal barrier function and can eventually affect the immune system that is all along our gastrointestinal tract. So if that is coupled with zinc deficiency, that can definitely impair the growth of children. So this is work that started when I was still at Cornell as a student, and this has matured. There are now studies that have confirmed these pathways in Africa and even in Nepal. We have not done these studies in the Philippines, and I hope those of you who are in these research areas would consider looking at this particular threat to child growth. Now, as I said, these are elimination and mitigation are the more recognized aspects of food safety. So I'm giving you some examples from rice. You know that farmers apply herbicides, molluscicides because of these pests in the rice fields, that they apply fertilizer so that we'll have better rice, I mean better yield, no? But the accomplishment of better yield should not come at the cost of food safety. And many of these chemicals need to be applied during the time when the grains are not yet there or are not yet mature enough, so that the least amount of chemicals are located in the grain when we finally harvest the plants and process them for consumption. But these, how will you put it, these caveats to the use of these chemicals are often not translated in ways that farmers can understand. And so when they apply these chemicals, sometimes they do it based on hearsay, or based on what other farmers are already doing, or based on what their fathers told them. And if those sources of information provide incorrect or information that has not been updated, or information that actually applies to other chemicals and not the ones that they are actually applying, we can run into problems. The other issue here is that many of these chemicals wind up in the water supply because they get washed away when the fields are flooded during the time when water is added to the fields, or they are washed away when we have floods, which come very often to our country. So I think that scientists need to think carefully about the actual field situation. So not just the experimental situation, but the actual field situation, so that they can provide, or they can make products that are safer to begin with, and then they can provide farmers with better information about the use of these chemicals. Now, another threat that we uncovered during our research in Erie, so I'm now referring to ore smelting here on the right, is that in places of the country that are close to mining areas, and we found at least well, several of them in the Philippines, because we have safety precautions. So the big mining companies, because they are monitored by DNR and other regulatory agencies, are more mindful actually about the safety precautions of water runoffs from mining. So this, of course, that's actually where the danger comes from, and that's how our food supply gets contaminated. But the small miners, the ones who operate at night, who are unregulated, who do this on the sly, they process the ores inside their homes, or they process these ores in safety houses up in the mountains where there is very poor regulation, very poor monitoring, and then they just dispose of the harmful chemicals that they use, and there are many, um, into the water system, and or the water canals of their particular municipality, and they wind up in rice fields. So this is actually a rice field that I took this picture, so I know that where this rice field is. I'm not going to mention it because of uh, some safety concerns, but there are this is happening. And when we looked at the rice grains, we did identify harmful chemicals, arsenic, cadmium, in the rice grains, and this, we attribute this to the water that is coming from ore processing areas. So I think this is, again, although I think DNR is aware of this, but the actual regulation and control is actually with local governments, because they are the ones who understand and can see these things. So we need to strengthen local governments to monitor and to enforce our regulations about water use in this case. And then the last example that I'm going to give you is on salinization. And this really has more to do with rice yield rather than food safety. But when the yield is too low, then of course our safety is also compromised. So we know that because of environmental pressures and because of climate change, that our rice fields, especially those that are close to coastal areas, are experiencing the salinization of not just of the water, but also of the soil. And so our research institutions like ERI are developing grains or varieties that can withstand higher salinity in the environment. But there's a limit to that, and we think that we need to have better mitigation measures in order to reduce the salinity in our rice grains. In our rice fields. So there's a lot of room for scientists to work here. I'm not going to go into detail. Some of you might actually know these things better than I do. I'm coming from the perspective of a nutrition specialist in this regard. Now on to our policy and regulation. We have a lot of food safety regulatory agencies. So all of these logos here on your left are actually DA, Department of Agriculture regulatory agencies, from every food group that DA handles, dairy, meat, animal industry, sugar, lahat yan. They all have their own agency to take care of regulations. On the part of consumption, we have the DOH, so that's the Food and Drug Administration of the DOH and the Bureau of Quarantine. But really at the forefront of all of these, because all of the DA and DOH agencies are national agencies, but where the rubber meets the road is where the local government units are. And I think that is one of the weakest links of our regulatory system, as you will appreciate in the next slide. So this is how just to remind you of this framework that we started with, the food systems framework, because it is really analogous to the food safety framework that the FDA has put together. And I have to acknowledge my colleague, Tim Mendoza, who comes from the food safety unit of the FDA for these slides. So this is how our food safety system is divided, if I may say so. So the food production side is of course under DA. The food manufacturing, if they are processed foods, fall under DOH FDA. And if it is imported, this will be Bureau of Quarantine. And then once they enter the market, it becomes the purview of DTI. And when it reaches the consumer, it is partly the role of the Department of Health as far as packaged foods are concerned, but all other parts of food safety, as you will see from the light blue bar at the bottom, is actually handled by the local government units. So imagine the scope of work of the local government unit. And I don't know if you've ever worked with the local government unit, or at least talk to someone from the local government units about what they do. You know that many of them do not have never mind the numbers, they do not have the technical capacity to implement many of our food safety regulations. So I think that this is the biggest loophole of our food safety framework, and it really underscores the need for other sectors to come in. So how does it all come together? There is a food safety coordinating board, as you can see here, and their functions are integration, crisis management, and a rapid alert system. So when something goes wrong, when there's an outbreak, then they come into play. But really, they should be coming into play on a regular basis, because the integration of systems is actually, I think, a bigger role, because that actually prevents rather than just reacts to food safety threats. So what are the challenges? And this comes strictly, I mean, largely from the FDA perspective. The uh, the challenges are in terms of coordination, in terms of institutionalizing policies, in terms of enhancing linkages so that nothing falls between the cracks. And we know from what we see in the news, hindi ko na pinakita in the interest of time, that many fall through the cracks. And the strengthening of implementation really requires, boots on the ground. So it's really the LGUs that need help, as although this says national government agencies, but it's true also that our national government agencies also need a lot of outreach individuals. I remember when I was working on a project in Palawan. Palawan has 24 municipalities, and as if you've ever been to Palawan, you know it's a long province with hundreds, if not thousands, of islands to be monitored. And in that entire province, there was one FDA person to implement all of the food safety regulations that are in the Food Safety Act of the Philippines and all of the implementing rules and regulations. So it is a huge task at the national level. I think it is even more challenging when you get to the LGUs, as I've been repeating over and over again. They do not have capacity in terms of numbers or in terms of technical expertise, and even just harmonizing local ordinances and policies is a big challenge. So much of the regulation or much of the implementation of policies and regulations actually falls on the food industry itself and on the consumers. So kumbaga, let the buyer beware, no? And that is why the FDA actually calls on the public to be aware, but the communication activities of our national agencies leave a lot to be desired. So this is an area where our behavioral scientists can probably help if we can increase or improve on the quality of the way we communicate food safety to the food industry. The food industry is actually, I think, more closely regulated, and so they actually are very responsive. But these are the larger food industry players. The small and medium sized, the ones that only operate within an LGU, fall under the purview of the LGU. And if the LGU doesn't do anything, then not much information reaches them either. So I think it is also important that small and medium enterprises are reached by these food safety this uh, food safety regulations and policies, especially at this time when so much food is being bought and consumed online. I mean, bought online and consumed at home. So the online procurement of food actually bypasses many of our food safety regulations. They have not been updated in that regard. So that and then they cross LGU borders. So you can buy pancit from Bulacan even if you are in Metro Manila. And so who has the jurisdiction over the food safety of your pancit? Is it the LGU in Bulacan or is it the LGU where you reside? No, so yung ganong klaseng mga issues have need to be sorted out so that the consumers are protected. Hindi pwedeng palaging caveat emptor, no? Or let the buyer beware. So we come to prevention and control, and this is I'm really going to speak mostly about total diet studies because this has been the process that FAO and WHO have recommended in order to have a better assessment of the risks coming from the diet in terms of chemicals and other components of food. So this is not just about harmful chemicals, these are also about beneficial chemicals. So in some ways, total diet studies can also contribute towards nutrient intake assessment. So this is why I think this is the way to go. A total diet study consists of selecting, collecting, and analyzing commonly consumed foods. And these are foods as you purchase them. So this is not coming from a warehouse, or this is not what's coming from the production side. This is what reaches the consumers. And then processing the food the way the consumers would process it. So if this food is boiled, then as part of the total diet study assessment, the food needs to be boiled. Or if this is fried, then the food needs to be fried. These are pooled into representative food groups, more for efficiency, and then analyzed for harmful and or beneficial chemical substances. Now, unfortunately, we have yet to do a total diet study in the Philippines. This is really unfortunate because so many of our neighbors have already started doing this, and they become the basis for policies and regulations and for communication advice to consumers. So this is a big gap in our food safety activities or actions. Now, I know that FNRI had started working on this, and I really wish that you know they have some results to show, but I was told that the earliest they will be able to show any results from an ongoing total diet study will be early next year. So let's watch out for that. At least merong in progress, no? It's not totally zero, but we have yet to see that. So I'm looking forward to that. So what are the essential principles of a total diet study? The foods that will be studied need to be representative of the whole diet. There is pooling of food. So as you can see here, for example, these pictures in the middle, they are all rice-based foods. So it is possible that they would pool these foods together if they're coming from a specific area. It really depends on what the target of investigation is for the total diet study. and the food is analyzed as consumed. So as you can see here, if it's puto, it is analyzed as puto. It is not analyzed as rice or sugar or the separate ingredients. So that is how total diet studies are conducted. Now I'm showing you these. These are all pictures from the market, and you can appreciate how will you say, how primitive, I'm gonna call it primitive our food handling is, no? So especially itong chicken na to, this is pinikpikan, and I took this picture somewhere in the north where pinikpikan is consumed. And really, when I saw this, ayaw ko nang kumain ng pinikpikan. I will only eat pinikpikan if I know who's preparing it, because it is no, not a very sanitary way of producing chicken. The packaging of our, especially our rice products, you know, rice is very vulnerable to a lot of contaminants. So when you package it this way, it just increases the risk of these contaminants, especially the living ones, to grow and multiply. And then these vegetables that come from, I think I took this also somewhere in the north, and you can still see the chemical residues at the base of the stalk of these bell peppers. So it really, we really need to tell consumers that when they buy vegetables, they have to wash them carefully, because this is the state of our food safety in our country. So this is how the foods are analyzed for total diet studies, the way that they reach the consumers. And that is the way we are able to trace or track harmful as well as beneficial components of the food. So how do we prioritize of the many kinds of foods that we consume? No? So this is a framework that FAO has put together. It's really I think it's self-explanatory, but the way to think about it really is, where are the risks coming from? So we need to think about food safety and consumer health. But secondarily, there are interests, of course, in terms of trade and the economy. If we are exporting food, for example, then we would like to be compliant with the trade requirements for these foods. And there are many food safety requirements for exporting food, especially if we export to more mature markets like the Europeans, who have very stringent rules about food safety. And then the soundness of the information, the time frame, if it is an outbreak, obviously, then we need to do things very fast. And then the scale at which we are capable of doing the study. So all of these need to be considered. And lately, and more, I think for sustainability reasons, we need to also consider the risks to the environment, as well as the equity considerations. Is this a food that affects a few, or is this a food like, you know, these are specialty foods consumed only by people for certain religious rites? That might not be as important as a food that is consumed largely by the poor. So those are different social dimensions that could be considered in prioritizing which foods to analyze for total diet studies. So because I don't have a Philippine example, I tried to look for some example that might be relevant to us, but still, you know, be close to our context. So I share with you an example from Hong Kong. I'm going to go very fast in the interest of time. So this was the first time that a total diet study was conducted in Hong Kong, and their particular interest here was to look at organochlorine pesticides. So Hong Kong imports a lot of their food, and they know that even if their own farmers probably do not use a lot of these pesticides, that farmers from other, where they from their source countries might be doing that. And that is why they decided to conduct this study almost 10 years ago na to. So we're really way behind, no? So they know that these organochlorine pesticides are largely, the exposure comes largely from the diet, especially from fish and meats. And it could be that drinking water and air can also be sources, as well as breast milk and maternal transmission. So, but then, of course, breast milk is not part of a total diet study. Drinking water is, so you can include, if the exposure of interest is something that is likely to come from water, then water can be part of the total diet study. So this is what they did. They sampled foods and then they grouped them, and they combined or pooled samples, as you can see from this procedure. This was from about, as I said, more than 10 years ago now. And these were the results. I'm not going to go into detail, just read them very quickly, because really it's just as an illustrative example that I'm sharing this. And what's nice about this report is that they also compared it to a previous study. The previous study was a smaller study of exposure to DDT. So here they compared DDT from that study and DDT from the current TDS, and they ascertained that there was a reduction in DDT content, which was consistent with the regulations. Remember that sometime in the 80s or 90s that DDT was banned. And so there was this documentation from Hong Kong that less DDT was now present in their diet. And then they concluded that the findings suggest that dietary exposures to OCP, organochlorine pesticide residues, analyzed in this study would be unlikely to pose unacceptable health risks to the general population in Hong Kong. And this was very reassuring, not just to the regulatory agencies, but of course, to the public in general. So as far as OCPs are concerned, then you can eat the food from Hong Kong. And if Hong Kong exports these foods, then we know that they are not likely to contain this particular chemical. So I look forward to the day when we can say the same thing about our food contaminants, and maybe with the help of everybody who's listening now, and if we can influence 10 other people to think the same way, we can say the same thing. So marami pong salamat. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Doc Says, for that very informative presentation about nutrition. May I call on Doc Menchi for moderating the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you so much, Doc Says.
Ma'am Says, good morning, and thank you so much for that amazing talk. I've learned so much this morning from all that you've talked about. I'm looking at the chat box, and if anybody has any comments, do please put your comments now, ma'am. But let me start this out with a very maybe profound question, ma'am. You're talking about food safety, right? And it is a very immediate need talaga. Lalo na yung mga pictures mo of how food is so used in our country, you know, how we prepare, and napaka, you know, say napaka barok in some places. But ma'am, what would be your suggestion? 'Di ba? You were saying that regulation is required, and you've shown all the ways that regulation can actually be done. And ngayon, it seems na wala tayong personnel, wala tayong trained people, and there's so much needs. But at the same time, ang dami naman itong kailangan na i-regulate, lalo na yung delivery ng food, the consumption at this. Where do we start? How can we just like start a simple way of doing this in from the consumer and the producer's point of view, na wala na tayong sistema but meron tayong pangangailangan? Paano kaya tayo magiging better at it? Kasi otherwise we'll just say, wala tayong magagawa, di ba? You know, wala tayong magagawa. Ganyan talaga ang sitwasyon. So over to you, ma'am. I know it's loaded, but you know, like them, I guess we want to do something. What can be done?
That's an excellent question. I think you know, we really have to start somewhere. And I would say, because of, I mean, I've worked in government for more than 20 years. So I'm a little realistic about how fast government can move. So in my recommendation is to start with the consumer and start with the private sector because they can move faster. So if we can get the message out to consumers, I mean, not to scare them that the food is unsafe, but to advise them on what to look out for when they are procuring food, what to look out for when they are preparing food, and then finally when they are storing food in their house, because there are also dangers from you know household storage. At least yun man lang, we can start with that, and then the next would be the consumer. I mean the small and medium enterprises. And the best way I would say, or the probably the most practical way would be to approach the LGUs, the local government units. So each of us who are, well, we all have our local government units. We can probably talk to the food safety officers of the local government units are usually in health. So pwede natin kausapin ang ating municipal health officer or the provincial health officer and find out how we can help them do their jobs. Of course, it's their job, pero how can we help them? Kasi dapat ma-translate. I hope that we are all Filipinos in the audience. We need to translate all of the regulations into something that can be applied at the barangay level. Kasi nandun yung pagkain nandun ang mga palengke, nandun ang mga bilihan ng pagkain. If you've ever seen the way food is stored in a sari-sari store, I think you will be a little concerned about buying from them. And yet 90% of our households access their foods through stores like sari-sari stores. So I would start there kasi at least yan, actionable. Small scale lang, yes, true. But if there are entities like, so I'm a member of the Philippine Association of Nutrition, and we have nationwide chapters. We can, and in fact, we're going to have a webinar on food safety also sometime in October. I think that we can have some way of at least documenting these actions and then assessing any impact from these actions. Kasi syempre, it's not enough that you do it. You have to document it to prove that it happened and then to learn from it. And that is why you need to put it together in some way, put it in a report or something so that we can improve on the way we do things. So we're all scientists. So I think it's not enough that we just do these advocacies. I think we need to have some way of monitoring and evaluating them, even if we are doing it in private capacities and not just in government. Government has its own systems for monitoring and evaluation, and that's fine. But the private sector should have the same things. The other is that I wish we had a strong consumer advocacy group. Wala tayong ganun eh. Meron tayong mga maliliit. And meron mga related to specific food, I would say food advocacies, no? So merong mga consumer groups that work on or that work with some industry partners, but specifically for what's going on in that food industry. Pero sana meron tayong yung consumer welfare as a whole. So malaking may tutulong nun para we can reach consumers and we can also work effectively with local governments. I hope that's helpful. Thank you, Menchi.
Naalala ko kasi, ma'am. Hey guys, just feel free to raise your hand. We are all friends here. And if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. I remember there was a time that there were ads on TV from the Consumer Association of the Philippines saying, no return, no exchange is not something that we should be sitting down. We should have this and we should have that. I think there are so many venues of doing this by sa Facebook, di ba? TikTok, ganyan, and which are not anymore monetized or needs to have investments. Ma'am, saan tayo makakakuha ng listahan or baka gusto mong gumawa ng listahan ng major messages, di ba? Yung what are the most important messages you think should be coming out there in broad terms? Let's say you're gonna make a TikTok or you're gonna make a ano, kasi you might want to do this, anybody in this group, on a voluntary basis, on their own personal capacity. This morning nga, ma'am, while you were talking, I said, everybody, you have to see this. And I just got the Facebook live stream of your talk and then pasted it somewhere. And then suddenly now I've seen comments already. So can you give us at least like 5 main messages? Kasi what we want to encourage is not a policing, di ba? Kasi kung policing, mamamatay tayo, so wala naman tao eh. Tsaka sino ang magpupulis? But more a voluntary advocacy, di ba? And passion to make things really good for us. So what would be like 5 main messages you would want to say? You can be as broad or you can be as specific as you want. Ano yun? Sorry, lagi kita on the spot ng Miss Universe questions. And Miss Universe
Oo
ka
nga.
naman eh. Of food.
Oo. I would start with ano ba yung pinaka high ang exposure natin and what are the risks coming from that. No? So obviously rice and rice products. Everybody eats rice, or most people, 90 plus 95% of Filipinos eat rice. So tingnan natin kung how is our rice, how does our rice reach our plates? And is that acceptable in terms of risk coming from a staple? Kasi it's not just that almost all of us eats rice. We consume it on a daily basis and we consume huge amounts of it. So kahit konti lang ang let's say ang potential risk for rice on a per gram basis, because we eat so much and because we eat it so often, the exposure can be huge. So yan yung kina-calculate sa total diet study eh, ang risk of exposure mo based on the type of food and also based on the frequency of consumption. So sa rice halimbawa, pasensya na kayo kasi syempre yun ang experience ko, so yun yung medyo pinakaalam ko. So I showed you some of the examples mostly from rice production, mga chemical inputs to rice production, things that can come from the soil or things that can come from the water. That's something that maybe farmers and DA are going to be able to relate to. Pero from the consumption side, so ikaw, bibili ka ng rice. Saan ka bibili? Bibili ka ba sa grocery? O bibili ka sa palengke? Or bibili ka sa neighborhood sari-sari store? Tingnan ninyo kung paano nila pinapackage or pinahandle yung rice. The safest way is for your rice to be vacuum sealed. I know that's a little more expensive than usual, but really vacuum sealing helps to reduce pest infestation of your rice, of your bigas, pag milled na yung rice, no? So yung ganong klaseng approach, you choose the food that is most commonly consumed and what are the possible risks. Kasi nakikita ko yung rice na binibenta sa palengke. Kita nyo naman, kung bibili kayo ng rice sa palengke, hindi naman sa sinasabi kong dapat sa grocery lang kayo bumili kasi syempre mas mahal doon, ano? Pero pag bumibili kayo sa palengke, bibili kayo pagka bagong salin yung rice doon sa kanilang mga wooden bins. And doon lang kayo sa mga nasa ibabaw. Huwag yung nasa ilalim kasi hindi nila nililinis yung mga wooden bins na yan. So whatever contaminants that may have come from, days or weeks or goodness, years of having rice in those bins, nandun pa rin yun, pero mostly nasa ilalim. So I think that that's one thing that we can, as consumers, for your own consumption, get the ones from the top. So obserbahan ninyo yung mga practices niyan. And so if you are a consumer group, you can choose a food of interest. I just gave rice as an example, but you might be interested in other things like eggs, for example. What are the things that consumers of eggs need to be careful about? So inspektuhin nyo yung eggs nyo, siguraduhin ninyong walang basag, siguraduhin yung walang abnormal na amoy. So they should smell like eggs, they shouldn't smell like other things. So yung mga ganon. And then normally, I'm talking about eggs now. Normally, ang itlog hinuhugasan talaga yan ng before they are sold to you. Kasi there are a lot of there's a lot of dirt and contaminants in the poultry. So dapat talaga hinuhugasan yan. Hindi lahat naghuhugas. So pagdating nyo sa bahay, hugasan nyo bago ninyo tawag mo before you break it open. Yes, because the shell protects what's inside. So if the shell is intact, then that's okay. But the other is that before you break it, make sure it's clean. And this is something I really wish we had for eggs that are sold in the market, an expiration date. Kasi alam naman natin lahat that eggs have a shelf life. After a week or two, especially if the environment is not conducive, those eggs are going to turn bad. Oo. So depende yan sa handling at saka sa storage kung gaano katagal yung pwedeng expiration date niyan. This is not my area of expertise, so I cannot speak of how long it should be. But those are things that we should watch out for when we are consuming eggs. The other would be, ano pa ba yung mga madalas nating binibili na may mga
chicken.
Chicken. So again, when you're buying chicken, it helps to know who's selling. Because then you can have confidence in the way that they were handled. So in some public markets, alam ko ngayon, pinagbabawal na ng local government ang pagtitinda ng chicken na nakalatag lang sa sa mga sa mga ng mga tindera, yung kanilang mga platforms dun sa palengke. Hindi na pwedeng ganon na naka-open lang siyang ganon. Dapat nakalagay siya sa temperature controlled container kasi ang bilis mag-deteriorate ng chicken. So para hindi naman maging unsafe at maging loss din to the tindera, di ba? They should really put them in same thing for fish, although with fish I think we are much more conscious about keeping fish in a cold environment. Pero even then, you need to know gaano katagal na ba yan na elado, di ba? Kung hindi siya completely frozen, then may problema yung loob. Pwede yung labas ay okay, pero yung loob ay hindi. And then, with fish, I still remember how my mother and my grandmother used to teach me how to buy fish. Tingnan mo yung mata, tingnan mo yung hasang, tingnan, amuyin mo, hawakan mo. Kasi all of those are really indicators of how fresh the fish is and whether it is safe to still eat them. So yun yung at the procurement side. And then the handling side, so pagdating mo sa bahay, yung fish mo, linisin mo na yan kaagad, even before you freeze them. Kasi if you freeze them diretso, whatever they acquired in the market, you also freeze them in your refrigerator. So I think it's your yung mga ganyang consumer practices, I think will also help. So so yun, choose the food, and then each food group has their own safety precautions. Oo. So pwede nilang anuhin yan. For vegetables and fruits, you have to really wash them. I showed you the example of bell pepper. That's also true of especially of fruits, kasi they yes, and tomatoes. So they spray them to extend the shelf life. They really do. And so you have to be worry about that and wash them carefully. Wash everything. Problema yan kasi ngayon dahil ang hirap-hirap ng tubig dito sa atin, ano. Pero you know, you have to find a way of unfortunately,
Washing our food, yeah.
making sure it doesn't have to be running water palagi. Pwede namang sa palanggana, basta papalitan mo rin yung tubig sa palanggana, no? Once you've washed one group, then you can throw that away, then you can wash the next group. Yung ganon.
Yeah.
So
Ganun, ma'am.
yes. Oh, yun. I think I'll stop there so that I see a
Yeah,
question here.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. I was gonna say that we are running a little bit over time, sorry guys, but we have one very important question here, and I guess we'll close with that. Ma'am, sabi ni Sir Timothy Cole Mendoza, thanks Dr. Says for promoting food safety in your assessment. How ingrained is food safety in the field of nutrition sa academe in general and in the education system? Like high school, elementary, vocational, what would be the approach to highlight food safety in this, you know, like in our training institutions at even the lower kids? Sorry guys, after this we'll have to close na. Bye.
Yeah. Well, thank
Thank
you
you,
very
ma'am.
much for the question, Tim. So actually, Tim is my source of the slides from FTA. Maraming
Oh,
salamat, Tim.
wow.
Oo. But really, I must say that I think in the field of nutrition, people are very mindful about food safety and its importance to food security. It is in the other health professions that there is less of a sensitivity or awareness, and even less so when you get to other professions and when you get down to the schools and elementary, no? So this is actually magandang tanong to kasi this also partly answers the question of Menchi kanina. This is another place where we can, as private individuals, help out, no? We can work with the PTAs of our schools. We can at least start with your school canteen or start with the baon of your children. But at the same time, when you are doing that, you are involving the children in these activities. So halimbawa pag ano ka ng baon ng anak mo and you're going to, let's say, pack well, I usually pack a fruit in my son's lunchbox. So I have him wash it before putting it in his lunchbox. When he puts in yung kanyang mga ulam, iniinit muna namin yan sa microwave para pagpasok sa lunchbox niya, I'm sure malinis siya at safe na kainin, no? And then if the school has their own microwave, so much the better. Yung mga ganon, no? So engage the children in the activity. I really like the idea of having school gardens, and that is something that DA and DOST are promoting kasi then we teach the children how to handle food or vegetables, fruits, whatever is being grown in the garden from the production side pa lang. And then through the harvesting and then through the handling. I think that it has to be very hands-on. I think that kasi ang hirap magpasok sa curriculum. We've tried to work with DepEd in the past. It's not that it's impossible, but it's a very, very, very long process. Kaya if you want something that can be done in a small way and effectively, you can do it in the private sector, I think. So, the
Yeah,
other
that's
thing,
a very
sorry.
good yeah,
Oh, sorry, isa pa.
Sige, ma'am.
Yung family development sessions ng 4Ps. The 4Ps, this is the conditional cash transfer program of DSWD, and they cater to the lowest quintile of income quintile of the country. So sila yung mga, they are required to attend family development sessions before they can get their cash allocation for the month, no? So, or for the quarter. So that's another opportunity to bring in food safety, and this is something that maybe DOH can bring up with the SWD. So at an institutional level, which reminds me, I was asked to review their updated version of their family development session. So I will check kung may food safety doon. Salamat team ha, gagawin natin yan. Salamat.
Thank you so much, Ma'am Ses. So, I wish we had time. Can you just advertise pala when you have your next session on on food safety, and then ang naisip ko rin, Ma'am Nolly, something related to food waste, And yung gusto ko yung term ni Ma'am Ses, na hindi lumabas ang nutrisyon sa sistema. So over back to you, Ma'am Nolly, and thank you so much, Ma'am, for this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc Menchi. Now we move to the next part of the webinar. Is really thanking Dr. Ses for her very impressive presentation. We are now giving her, on behalf of PAASE, the Certificate of Appreciation. This is proudly presented to Dr. Cecilia Cristina S. Aquin for graciously sharing her expertise in her talk entitled First, Do No Harm, Food Safety Matters in Nutrition, during the PAASE webinar series organized by the Research Expertise Cluster Council, given this 23rd day of September 2022. Thank you very much, Doc Ses.
Thank you very much, PAASE. Thank you very much, Nolly, for inviting me. It has been my pleasure to share this webinar with you. And yes, we will invite you when PAN has its own food safety webinar sometime in October. So marami pong salamat din sa inyong lahat.
Okay, thank you so much, Doc Ses. Thank you very much. Now we are going to move on to just a few announcements. PAASE is going to have a fireside chat on mentoring, representation, and equity. This is sponsored by PAASE and AFSA, or the Association of Filipino Scientists in America. This will be on September 30th. Next week at 8 a.m. The reactors for the session will be Dr. Zinia Tigno and Dr. Joel Coelho. And AFSA will be represented by Dr. Lowell Iporak and Dr. Carla Bertulfo. So hope to see you there again, everyone. Thank you so much. And then the last announcement is about our upcoming 2022 annual PAASE meeting and symposium that will be held on October 11th to 14th in 2022. And registration is ongoing now. So please register, and everybody is enjoying to attend. Doc Ses, please be there as well. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming and attending this very interesting webinar. Thank you, Doc Menchi. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc Ses. Thank you.
Maraming salamat. See you guys.
Next week.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.